first snowstorm of each year is usually a hectic time at major airports, as pilots, dispatchers, ground staff, and passengers have to adjust to the realities of cold weather operations. Each year, for some, whether they are new airport employees, pilots, or passengers who have never flown in snow, a small learning curve is necessary, and sometimes that curve can be a bit too steep. November 15th, 1987, Stapleton International Airport, Denver, USA. It's 12 noon in Denver, and a Continental Airlines DC-9 has been parked for over an hour waiting for takeoff clearance. But the day has been hectic at the airport. The snowfall that came down overnight is delaying flights, and for now, they'll have to wait. Continental Airlines Flight 1713 is a regular service from Stapleton Airport in Denver, Colorado, to Boise, the capital of Idaho. The pilot in command, Captain Frank Zvonek Jr., 43 years old, had just flown in from his home in sunny San Diego earlier this morning and arrived at Stapleton just minutes before his scheduled time, only to find the airport being covered by the first snowfall of the winter season. It was also the first snowfall of his career as a DC-9 pilot, which had begun in April after several years flying Cessna Citation private jets. He had logged over 12,000 flight hours, certainly including many in winter conditions, but only 166 hours in the DC-9, of which just 33 were as captain. Despite those numbers, today, he was the most experienced of the two pilots. Captain Zvonek's co-pilot on Flight 1713 was First Officer Lee Brucher, a 26-year-old newcomer who had joined Continental 3 months earlier and had no more than 36 hours of experience in the DC-9. No one at the airline knew that Brucher's respectable total of 3,200 flight hours masked a troubled history of failures and difficulties during training. Most of those hours had been logged in the twin turboprop Beech 1900. His training had gotten off to a bad start when the FAA instructor who trained him had his license revoked for skipping elements of the check ride. Then, in March 1985, he was fired from an airline after failing 3 check flights, despite receiving twice the amount of training other pilots got. Instructors reported serious errors, including descending below minimum altitude on instrument approaches. Nevertheless, just days after being fired, he was hired by another company, where instructors again noted his struggles with instrument approaches and disorientation. As a result, he failed an FAA type rating check in 1986, but eventually passed on a later attempt and was promoted to captain on the 19-passenger Beech 1900. From there, he moved on to Continental, a major airline that, in 1985, was still struggling with high pilot turnover after firing its unionized crews in 1983. As the pilots of Flight 1713 prepared for departure, the scheduled departure time of 12:25 came and went, as the snowstorm continued to cause delays across the network. By the time the door was closed, there were 82 people aboard the DC-9, including 5 crew members and 77 passengers, leaving only 8 empty seats, most of them in the business class cabin. While waiting for clearance, the pilots discussed who would fly each leg of the route, since the same aircraft would be returning to Denver that night. One of the flight attendants, concerned about the co-pilot's inexperience, asked the captain to take the return leg himself, as she had a bad feeling about Brucher landing in the snow and ice back in Denver. This meant that First Officer Brucher, with just 36 hours of experience flying the DC-9, would be the one taking off and flying from Denver to Boise. At 1:03 p.m., Flight 1713 received their first communication from the control tower, informing them of the route they would follow after takeoff. The The pilots knew that before departure, they would need to head to the de-icing pad to remove the snow and ice that had accumulated on their wings. However, there seemed to be some confusion about the proper sequence of operations. The correct procedure was to call ground control, request permission to taxi to the de-icing area, and then request clearance to taxi to the runway once de-icing was complete. But the pilots began moving without contacting ground control, heading straight to the de-icing pad in a rush. As a result, shortly after receiving their route clearance, they left the gate without authorization, unnoticed by the controllers. Unaware of their mistake, the crew took their DC-9 to the de-icing area, where technicians sprayed the wings with a heated glycol and water solution designed to eliminate ice and snow. As the de-icing fluid hit the aircraft, Captain Zvonek joked, "This is like going through a car wash." When de-icing concluded at 1:46 p.m., the wings appeared to be free of ice and snow. The pilots restarted the engines, and Captain Zvonek called clearance delivery to report.
Continental 1713, we're ready for clearance.
Continental 1713, left side, taxi to the pad, give way to two company aircraft on the south side of Delta heading to 3. That's an Airbus and an MD-80.
Roger.
This exchange had failed to clear up the misunderstanding. Since Flight 1713 had never requested permission to taxi from the gate, the ground controller believed they were asking for clearance to taxi from the gate to the de-icing pad, while the crew was actually requesting clearance to taxi from the de-icing pad to the runway. By using the word pad, the ground controller left the interpretation up to the crew, and Zvonek and Brucher evidently thought he was referring to the departure pad at the end of runway 35 left. Still without the proper clearance, Flight 1713 joined the departure queue for runway 35 left, taxiing through the airport in the midst of steady snowfall. As they approached the runway, they found two other Continental flights already lined up ahead of them, while two more flights were waiting on the opposite side of the departure pad, having come from a different terminal. As the minutes ticked by, the flights ahead of them were cleared for takeoff.
We're next.
But the tower controller was unaware of Flight 1713's presence at the runway threshold. In fact, the next aircraft they heard being cleared was Continental 594, a plane still at the de-icing pad with its engines shut down. From that point on, things became even more complicated at the airport. The DC-9 was now in first position without takeoff clearance, with Continental 594 stopped behind them, and the controller, viewing from his position, mistook the DC-9 for a stationary MD-80 with some kind of issue. The tower then cleared another flight from the opposite entry point, a 737. At this point, First Officer Brucher, growing frustrated, called the tower.
Control tower, this is 1713. We've been number one in line for quite a while.
Are you the MD-80?
Negative, DC-9.
By that moment, 21 minutes had passed since Flight 1713 had completed de-icing, and they still hadn't received clearance for takeoff. Now, they would have to wait for a landing to occur on the parallel runway. In fact, Flight 1713 didn't receive clearance to enter the runway until 2:12 p.m. At 2:14 p.m., First Officer Brucher reported they were in position, and the tower replied with a simple thank you. As Brucher began to power up the engines, the tower cleared Flight 1713 for takeoff, and Captain Zvonek acknowledged the clearance. The pilots pushed the throttles forward to full takeoff power, and 6 seconds after 2:15 p.m., the aircraft was rolling. By then, more than 27 minutes had passed since the last de-icing. Too long. On the wings of Flight 1713, imperceptible to most outside observers, a thin layer of ice had reformed. Unfortunately, the inexperienced crew of Flight 1713 appeared unaware of the danger. The Continental DC-9 raced down the runway, and Captain Zvonek called out, 100 knots, looking for 139. Seconds later, they reached 139 knots, and he called, VR. The first officer pulled back on the controls to rotate. He did so too aggressively. With the main landing gear still on the ground, the aircraft pitched up sharply, causing its angle of attack to exceed the critical threshold. The aircraft lifted off, and Captain Zvonek announced, positive rate, but they were already out of control. Without warning, the plane lost lift and dropped back toward the ground. The left wing struck the ground, scraping across the snow-covered earth. The cockpit voice recording ended abruptly, but the crash continued. The plane bounced, spun, and flipped completely over before finally coming to a stop inverted, leaving a long trail of debris scattered across the snow. While some people were able to get up and walk away from the crash site, the vast majority were trapped inside the crushed fuselage with no obvious way out. The most accessible escape route was the DC-9's tail cone exit, but with the aircraft upside down, the hatch opened upward and was blocked. Flight attendants and passengers tried to open the door, but at first couldn't manage it. Eventually, they were able to escape about 10 minutes after the crash. Fortunately, the aircraft did not catch fire. Had it done so, the situation would have been far worse. In the end, the last survivor wasn't rescued until nearly 4 hours after the crash, as dusk fell over Denver. Many others weren't as lucky. Of the 82 people on board, 54 survived, while 28 lost their lives, 19 in the impact, and 9 more from mechanical asphyxiation while trapped in the wreckage. Among the dead were both pilots and the forward flight attendant, as well as most of the passengers seated on the front left side of the cabin, which absorbed the brunt of the crash. What had happened? Was the co-pilot's error alone serious enough to cause this disaster, or was there more? The investigation was led by the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, which sent a team of experts to examine all potential causes of the crash. The key question was why Flight 1713 failed to climb and appeared to lose control moments after takeoff. Continental Airlines developed its own early theory in the investigation, that the flight was hit by wake turbulence from a wide-body Boeing 767 that had landed on parallel runway 35 right about 3 minutes earlier. Continental supported this scenario in a report it submitted months into the investigation, but the NTSB was skeptical. Citing NASA research on wake turbulence, they noted that the distance between the two runways was likely too great for the turbulence to have reached Flight 1713 within the time that had passed. Meanwhile, suspicions about the role of ice had been growing since the early phase of the investigation. The plain fact was that 27 minutes had passed between de-icing and takeoff, plenty of time for ice to reaccumulate on the wings before the ill-fated departure attempt. Two passengers did report seeing ice and snow on the wings, though one later had their personal credibility questioned by Continental Airlines, likely for liability reasons. The NTSB was also able to support its theory mathematically. Based on the water content of the snow and the rate of precipitation, the NTSB estimated that 0.03 inches of rough ice could have formed on the wings of the DC-9 during the 27 minutes on the ground after de-icing. Previous studies had already shown that as little as 0.03 inches of rough ice on a DC-9 wing could reduce maximum lift by 20%. As a result, the aircraft stalled before reaching the stall warning threshold, and in fact, no stall warning was heard on the cockpit voice recorder at any time. The pilots likely never realized they were entering a stall, but the flight data recorder showed there was more to the story than just ice on the wings. Although it didn't record pitch angle directly, it was possible to infer it from altitude data. A sharp drop in altitude relative to the runway's elevation, due to airflow changes around the static pressure sensors, revealed that Flight 1713 rotated twice as fast as normal, about 6 degrees per second, and may have reached a pitch attitude of 14 degrees, much higher than the usual 9 degrees. These data confirmed that both wing icing and the excessive rotation rate were critical to the accident sequence. In conclusion, it was clear that had First Officer Brucher pulled back on the controls in a normal fashion during takeoff, the accident likely would not have happened. This finding led the NTSB to question multiple aspects of the decision-making by both the pilots and the airline. A background check revealed that Brucher was a problematic pilot who struggled with basic flight control, despite his efforts to improve. Considering Brucher had only 36 hours of jet experience and hadn't flown in nearly a month, facts likely known to Captain Zvonek, the NTSB questioned Zvonek's decision to let him handle the takeoff from Denver during a snowstorm. Zvonek had been more focused on the challenges of landing back in Denver on the return leg, but the relatively higher risk of landing obscured the still substantial risk involved in taking off. The NTSB suggested that in such a situation, the prudent choice would have been for the captain to handle the takeoff and then transfer control to the first officer for the remainder of the flight. The NTSB noted that this dilemma could have been resolved with better technology that was already available in Europe. European publications on winter operations prescribed the use of Type 2 anti-icing fluid, which has significantly longer-lasting anti-ice properties, allowing aircraft to wait much longer than 20 minutes before dangerous amounts of ice could reform. As a result, the NTSB recommended studies on the effectiveness and feasibility of introducing Type 2 fluid in the United States. Although similar recommendations had to be reissued following other ice-related accidents in 1989 and 1992, these new solutions were eventually adopted, and the anti-icing fluid used today protects aircraft surfaces against refreezing for several hours.